Just thinking this thing's on. Hello, New York. Thank you. Anyway, welcome to New York Comic Con. This is the Monsters, Zombies, and Everything Else That's Out to Eat You Alive panel. Let me introduce myself, and before we get to our panel, I am Ollie Kokmen, by day a mild-mannered bookseller for Barnes & Noble, looking after our ebooks on our book platform. If you buy an ebook today, please make it a Nook book, and if you buy one, why not buy two? So that's my day, and my evening, I get to be on the bench to bring you a august group of authors who have dedicated their lives and their skills to scaring the bejesus out of you. I'd like to introduce our panel, and I'm going to attempt to do this in order, but if I get this wrong, please wave. First is Adam Mansbach. His books include the #1 international bestseller, Go the Something to Sleep, as well as the critically acclaimed novels. I'll just keep saying it. As well as the critically acclaimed novels Rage is Black, Angry Black White Boy, and The End of the Jews. His work has appeared in New Yorker, New York Times Book Review, Esquire, and he's contributed to National Public Radio's All Things Considered, which means perhaps you're familiar with his voice but don't know what he looks like, and now's your chance to know. Next is Richard Kadrey, New York Times best-selling author of the Sandman Slim series, Kill the Devil, Mohawk Propel, Devil's Head Bang, Butcher Board, Metro Feed, more than 50 other stories, and has been immortalized in an action figure. Next on the dais, we have Diana Rowland. Which one of you is Diana again? Diana has lived her entire life below the Mason-Dixon line. She's worked as a bartender, blackjack dealer, pit boss, street cop, detective, computer forensic specialist, CSI, and morgue assistant, which means she's seen more than her share of what humans can do to each other and to themselves. She's won the Marksmanship Award in her police academy class as a black belt in Hapkido and has handled many dead bodies, which makes her possibly the coolest person in the room. Is David Wellington, born? Yes, sir. Out here. Hello. Born in, I understand was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where this crew is most important as the town where George Romero shot his classic monster zombie films. And is known for his serialized zombie novels, including Monster Island, where a bunch of monsters take over Manhattan, is it?
Well, the entire world, but yes.
Let's start at Manhattan. Is there anything about this that reminds you of that? Never mind, we'll get back. In 2006, he serialized 13 Bullets, a vampire novel at 13bullets.com, and is a New York City native. And then next is Jonathan Maberry. Maberry, sorry. New York Times bestselling author, multiple Bram Stoker Award winner, writer of many fan-favorite comics, including great stints on Doom War, Black Panther, Captain America, and the just-announced Bad Blood from Dark Horse. And has written many things that don't have pictures associated with it, including Dead of Night, Patient Zero, and the Rot and Ruin series. E.B. Hudspeth. Can I just call you Eric?
Yes.
Thank you. Eric is raised in Colorado, but lived in several states throughout the U.S. while growing up. He is, as well as a writer, an artist, and sculptor whose media includes snow, ice, and marble, which led him to a stint in Italy, where he worked as a marble sculptor, and there, working on designs there of impossible beings, began to inform the work, The Resurrectionist, which he's here talking about today. And then, at the end of the line is Peter Brett, the internationally best-selling author of the Demon Cycle series, The Warded Man, The Desert Sphere, The Daylight War, which have been translated into 23 languages worldwide, which is probably more than any one of us here speaks, with the possible exception of Diana. and has also written Red Sonja Blue and Red Sonja Unchained for Dynamite Comics. So we're here to talk about, as monsters and zombies, things that scare you, things that keep us up at night, keep us turning pages. One of the questions that I want to pose to our panel is, it occurs to me that when we're talking about monsters, whether they're zombies or supernatural creatures or whatever else, we're drawing so much from folklore and from traditional known creatures. There's a known engine. There's something known about vampires and zombies. So the challenge must be how to make them new and interesting for your audiences in your work. And I was just wondering how you approach that. And I thought maybe we could start with Eric, since your book, The Resurrectionist, literally looks at some classic monsters in a brand new way, as it is in part an old-timey illustrated anatomical dissection of a bunch of creepy monsters. Where did this come from? What twisted path has brought you to this juncture?
Okay. It started as an anatomy project for a sculpture. I was working on an angel, and I was trying to figure out how best to make the wings come into the body in a way that made physiological sense. And so I started with the sketches, and of course the challenge was pretty clear. And so I really enjoyed the results of trying to figure out how to marry the wings into the body and so on. And I just put it into other creatures, and how would that look anatomically accurate if you were to make a chimera or a heartworm. And from there, I grew a story out of it of a mad scientist who this was his agenda, was to recreate these beings. And there's a lot of his philosophy as to why this is important and pertinent to his work. And the horror kind of grew out of that.
Amazing. It is fun to think of an illustrated novel that's not illustrated in the typical way that comics are, especially at a venue like this, like Comic-Con. Adam, what about you? Your story is drawn from the Mexican boogeyman, and because we're friends here, right? Having grown up in the frigid Arctic of Minnesota, Mexican folklore is not really something I was very familiar with.
Yeah. Well, first let me say, I'm new to all this, and so this is the first time I've been at one of these conventions. I gotta say, y'all motherfuckers are a lot better dressed than like literary fiction fans. Also, unlike literary fiction fans, you exist. So for me, in delving for the first time into genre, it was important to me to think about the ways in which the things that scare us, the monsters that we live with and have created and have evolved and sort of grappled with over millennia, are ultimately parts of ourselves. You know, the things that scare us are primordial and primal, and that is because they represent something within us for the most part. So I wasn't a student really of Aztec mythology going into the book, but I was a student of other mythologies, and I think what they all have in common is that the external begins with the internal. So the monsters we create are initially elemental and things that we fear. You know, like I grew up reading Greek mythology, and when I got older and I started investigating what was behind the stories, you realize that like every Greek myth out there basically is a ritualization of the death of the sacred king. You know, the king serves for a year, and then every part of Greece had their own version of how that motherfucker was like ripped apart, you know? Sometimes there was a surrogate, but somebody was gonna die. That was just part of it. You reign for a year, and then you get ripped up. And, you know, I think for me, it's all about the kind of duality. Like, a story only works if there's something recognizable in the evil force and something recognizably dark in the good force. And those two, thank you. Those two forces have to meet somewhere. There's got to be something recognizable in each one by the other one. Does that make sense? Okay, then I'll stop talking.
Diana, you work both with talk about demons and also with about zombies, two of the classic paranormal monsters that are out there. How do you approach making both of them interesting and unique for audience? And by the way, thank you for the book's White Trash Zombie Apocalypse, without which none of us would put those 4 words in a sentence.
Yeah, I'm waiting for my Pulitzer. I kind of got to go back to how I got the idea for the White Trash Zombie series. I worked in a morgue. This was after many years of working as a police officer. Okay, in an autopsy, when they take the organs out, my job was to take the brains out, among other things. And when you take the brains out, you take a scalpel and make a cut from one ear to the other on top of the head, peel the scalp back over the face and down, then you take a bone saw, cut the top of the skull off, you take this tool called skull cracker, which is like a chisel type thing, you stick it in there, twist it, skull pops off, you pull it off with this great little sucking sound. There's your brain. Then you get your hands in there, gloved, get a scalpel, you cut the brain stem, pull the brain out, then you put it on the scale for the pathologist to weigh and measure and do all the stuff. And then all the other organs are taken out too. Well, they don't put them back into the body after they're done measuring and sampling. They put them in a big plastic bag, which goes to a funeral home, and then I think they fill it with lime or something like that, and they just bury it. So one day I was pulling the brain out and said, wow, this is really a waste. You know, zombie would love this. What a waste. They're just throwing away a buffet. Think about those starving zombies in China. And it says something for the people I worked with that they didn't go, huh? And that's part of, that's how I got the idea for the zombie stuff. But also in working as a police officer and in the morgue and in death investigation, I got a good chance to see how everybody lives on pretty much every end of the social spectrum. You're called out to domestic violence scenes in the crappy neighborhoods as much as you are in the very, very rich neighborhoods. Same with drug addiction and drug overdose and stuff like that. It hits all spectrums. But how people are able to deal with that, the monster there is things like addiction, and poverty, and education, healthcare, stuff like that. And it really makes a difference. If you're rich, you know, they say money can't buy happiness, but it sure makes it a lot easier to get all these things. So a lot of what I look at is how characters change when bad shit happens to them. And I can say shit because he was a motherfucking homeless.
I am never being invited back.
At San Diego Comic-Con, they have a little sign saying, there may be kids in the audience, please don't curse, or words to that effect. They don't have that here. So, you know, there's a difference between monsters and monstrous. Some of the biggest monsters we know of, like Jeffrey Dahmer, does not look very monstrous. And so the White Trash Zombie is told from the point of view of the zombie, and she's dealing with very monstrous things. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Just so happy that the story didn't involve, and I forgot lunch one day. Oh dear. But it occurs to me, part of having monsters or scary things in your stories has to be a part of making them a part of the world in which you've built for them. How do you approach? It's got to be challenging to create a world that includes all of these extra elements and still have it be new and exciting and fresh for readers.
Well, with the zombie stuff, it's kind of almost a metaphor for addiction, because my character in the beginning of the series is a white trash, pill-popping, alcoholic, high school dropout, felon, loser.
Reminds me of my mother.
I drew on
Louisiana. She's from Louisiana. She might have been.
Yeah, right. And when she becomes a zombie, suddenly she's not addicted to all these things anymore, but now she's addicted to brains. And it's a coming-of-age story. It's a zombie building world.
It's an allegory. It's a metaphor.
There's a lot of character growth about how she has to become responsible. She has to keep a job in the morgue, first job she's ever kept, in order to survive. So very, very much a character-oriented story.
Jonathan, what about, how do you approach world building with these extra zombie-ish elements in there?
There's a little bit of backstory to that. I had snuck into the movie theater at age 10 to see the world premiere of Night of the Living Dead. And from that point on, I've been thinking about zombies and what it would be like to be in a zombie apocalypse, would I survive one, and so on. And when I sat down to map out Rotten Ruin, the 4-book series, I started with the question of what would happen if you survived the zombie apocalypse? What would the next day look like, the next week, the next year? And I started the story 14 years later, so that there are little towns of people surviving in the 7 billion zombies out there. And I thought, well, what's day-to-day life in a town where the zombies are a real thing? The kids who are the star of the story grew up with that as the only reality. So what would that day-to-day life be? There would have to be some sort of commerce, would have to be jobs. What jobs would exist in a world where zombies were there? So my world building started with the kids going out to find a job. They had to get a job within their town or they would lose their rations. So I learned about that world in the same way that I informed the readers about the world through the process of looking for a job. Like, for example, one of the jobs is carpet coats. You can't really bite through carpet. I mean, you can try, but you're not going to really bite through it. And zombies rotting would have, weaker dental ligature, so they're not going to bite through it. So it makes sense to make, garments out of things the zombies couldn't bite through. So that would be an industry. People would have to find a way to make money on it. Locksmiths, in the Rot and Ruin world, just as in Night of the Living Dead and The Walking Dead and others that follow the Chimera model, anyone who dies for whatever reason comes back as a zombie. That was Romero's original thing. So locksmith would be a big thing. Everybody would lock themselves in their room at night, because if you died in the middle of the night, you'd wake up all bitey, and that would be a problem for the family. So locks, everybody would have a lock. Zombies can't turn a key. Living people can. So my world building was based on the nuts and bolts day-to-day life in a post-apocalyptic world. And by figuring that out, it gave me not only the basis for the story, but it gave me insight into the characters and what their experience would be living in that world. And it just blew up from there. It was easy to follow the train of common sense logic from those, just from how people get through their day.
Peter, you too have built an elaborate world with in your demon psycho.
I could go all literary here and say that the book's really just about the demon inside ourselves, but I think I'm going to skip that. Everything in my world is tied together. So the entire magic system is based on the demons that are in the series. The demons exist in this place called the core, which is the center of the world, and it's a place that's filled with magic. And when they drift up to the surface at night to attack human beings, they take on the properties of whatever terrain they pass through. So every demon is different. They're kind of like kaiju, like one looks like a fish and another one looks like a tree. So I have rock demons that come up in the mountains, and there's wood demons that come up in the woods, and there's field demons that come up in the field. And so I can have a wide variety, because the word demon, unlike zombie or vampire or other things, has very broad interpretations throughout folklore. So I wasn't really tied down to anything like that. And so the only magic in the world is those demons, and the people that use magic leech it off of them and repurpose it in a certain way. So that ties the whole world together into the things. But I completely agree with Jonathan's approach, which is the same approach I took. I started my series 300 years after the demon apocalypse. Like, the demons had retreated for thousands of years. Humankind had built a very high technological society, and then it was all brought down overnight when the demons came back. And now we're starting out in a place where there's small villages of survivors who have to lock themselves in every night and draw magical symbols around themselves, around their homes and farms to protect them. And that vastly changed what jobs were available, what the lives of these people were like. And I say I was going to go literary, but the truth is, when you're locked in at night, huddled in fear over the monsters in the dark, and you can't go anywhere until morning, how does that affect the way people treat each other? And that is the real kind of crux of the story, and the characterization in the story is, what does that do to the people who live in that kind of terror every night, and how does that make them treat each other? And some of them become very heroic to protect each other, and then some of them become very selfish to protect themselves, and it permeates through the entire series. And so I think that ties the whole world together.
David, so in addition, still here? I'm 5'6" in a 6-foot world. I can barely see any of you. So you've written the zombie and the vampire series novels, but your latest Chimera is sitting right in front of you, but also takes a scientific technical thriller approach where the monsters, in some ways, are man-made. Does that change your approach to approaching scary storytelling?
No. They're still monsters. No, it's been done before, so everything I do has been done before. I think everything you can do at this point has probably been done before. I still dream of the day when I'll invent a new monster that actually scares people as much as, say, vampires or zombies. My approach has always been the same, and it was the same with this. It was, my approach is you look at what has come before and you don't do that. I get bored writing the same story that somebody else already told. So if I get bored, I won't finish a book. So I have to come up with something new, or at least a different slant. With the zombies, I did that. Well, okay, I'll tell you my process with this, because I go back, I look at the folklore, watch the movies, read the books, all looking for things I don't want to do. So the whole thing with zombies and brains, which fascinatingly enough didn't get started until 1985 with Return of the Living Dead. Before that, zombies didn't just eat brains, they ate people, whatever they could get their hands on. So my zombies will eat anything. They'll eat the bark off of a tree, they'll eat they'll scrape the gum up off the sidewalk and eat that. With vampires, well, that was tricky because, as everybody knows, vampires are these pretty sparkly things. But I did some really hardcore research, and the younger people in the audience may not know this, but vampires used to drink human blood. That's scary. So I actually went back, all the way back to like Eastern European folklore, looking at vampires, and they're very, very different. They're much closer to zombies than what we have now. And so I kind of went all the way back to like Nosferatu for my vampires. Werewolves, I did my own thing with that. Now this is essentially, they're kind of like Frankenstein's monster in a way. I'm not going to give any spoilers for the book because you should all read it because it's very good. And I'm not just saying that because my dad likes it, but he does, so you would too. Anyway, so I wanted to do something a little different with Frankenstein's monster, and brought in a little bit of Blade Runner, brought in a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then finally said, what can I do that's completely new, and added that to the mix. So that's always been my process, is don't get bored while you're writing.
Richard, what's your approach? Because it does occur to me that, particularly in Sandman Slim, unlike some other stories where involving these monsters and demons and scary creatures, your protagonist is one of the scariest, as Adam might say, motherfucker, ever to be in the pages.
Yeah, I wanted to create a world in which Stark lived. He is a monster and lives among other monsters, and to kind of give it that almost banal, everyday feel. So my monsters, this is all set in LA, my monsters just are other citizens of Los Angeles doing monstrous things, which happens in every big city. And what I try to do is to avoid most of your classic monsters. So I try to create completely my own mythology. So vampires are pretty much the only recognizable regular monster I have. And everything else I've tried to create from scratch just because, like my second book, if you want to talk about zombies, Kill the Dead is a zombie book. But one of the first things I wanted to do was avoid the George Romero model, because I think there's a fine line between homage and ripoff, and I just have this bad feeling that Romero's work has just been used too much. So, and a lot of my book is about the myth of angels and the myth of the fall of angels and who Lucifer is and who God is. So I tried to tie my zombies in with the fall of angels and to see where that took it. So I think I would just basically cheat. I don't want to play with the regular monsters just because I feel locked into a system where you're starting to either explain it or trying to back yourself out of it. So, yeah, I just went the other way.
So, that's great. I think, so, you invoked this earlier, so I think let's poll the audience. And can we get agreement that vampires somehow are no longer scary? Is that basically true?
Yeah.
Basically, that's a pity.
You should read my book. It's called 13 Bullets, and it will scare you.
With the exception of the vampires of 13 bullets. Vampires are no. But obviously, we're living in a zombie renaissance. So, to anyone who has an opinion on this, why are zombies popular now? Why have zombies captured the popular interest when vampires clearly haven't? It can't possibly all be that sparkly thing.
Well, when I invented the zombie genre in 2003, I joke, but in fact in 2003 there were only about 4 or 5 zombie novels in existence. And the only reason I thought I could even write one was because I didn't realize how few there were. I wrote 3 zombie books. They did very well for me. By the time the 3rd one came out in print, Variety had a headline on its cover saying, "Zombies are dead." And that was in 2007.
Wait, I get that.
That was like 2007, so that was, a long time ago. That was like, 23 years ago? And they've been saying it every year since. It's fascinating to me because I actually get people come up to me and say, "Why are you still writing about zombies? That's not cool anymore." And I'm like, are you kidding? Like, are you actually looking at what's on television, movies you're making? What always blows me away about this is this idea that somehow zombies are going through a renaissance is just false. There's been a zombie movie every year since 1968. And there are zombie movies slated for at least the next 3-4 centuries. So it's still going strong. People like zombies. Zombies are the 21st century monster. Vampires and werewolves, very much 19th century monsters. They're tied to, ideas of abomination and evil. Zombies are not. They're just about consumption, consumerism. They are about, being alone in a world full of people. They tie into themes that we can all identify with today in a way that many older monsters just can't anymore. In this sense, they are perfect for our day and age. I think zombies really came to the fore in the age of terrorism, and there is a definite link there. This sort of idea, you young kids are not going to even remember 9/11. I know you're all like 12. It feels that way to me. I'm 42. But before September 11th, things were very different, and we forget that. We've kind of entered into this age of unease and paranoia with other people. We are afraid of people who live in other countries. We are afraid that they're going to come here. We're afraid that they are here. And that is really the center of the zombie myth. There are lots of them. They're out there, and they're coming closer.
Zombie as avatar of the other. Peter, you're looking very pensive. You've got a thought about this.
I think when you're saying what is it about zombies that is so attractive to people, I think there's, let's say 3. 3 is always a good number. First is fear of death. Everybody's going to die. Everybody knows they're going to die. And unlike vampires, which are dead and beautiful and young-looking, zombies look like what we really think we're going to look like when we're dead. And so I think there's an innate fear of that. 2 is infectious disease. You get bit by a zombie, you're going to be a zombie. And the more people they bite, the more it's going to spread, and any other people that die are going to turn into zombies. And the idea that it's going to grow exponentially and take over the world is terrifying, the same way that superflus are terrifying and other things of that sort. And so those are 2 basic fears that are inherent to every single person that I think zombies kind of exemplify. And then on top of that is the same thing that Jonathan was talking about and I was talking about, and is so well exemplified in things like The Walking Dead, is the idea of once society starts to break down, and all of the basic services that we depend on to be civilized go away, what does that do to all the people that are living and have survived? How do they start treating each other? What drama happens between them in between the zombie attacks? How do they find clean water? Like, how long does canned food last before you can't eat it anymore? Those sorts of things, like, we all worry about natural disasters. We all worry about things that are going to shake the foundations of our everyday life. And the zombie apocalypse is a good way to kind of create like a fantasy version of that, but it's all things that we really are worried about in real life, and it's a way to kind of distance ourselves and look at what that's going to be. And I think that's what makes the genre so attractive and why it's not going anywhere.
For something on that, sir. Talking about vampires. Now, vampires, yes, for a while they moved toward being so romanticized that they became tragic, beautiful characters. But there's a movement away from that with a lot of writers. Justin Cronin with The Passage, and Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan with Strain. Other people have been moving toward going back to scary vampires and new kinds of vampires, and even, as David mentioned, going back to the folkloric vampires and finding how scary they were before they became the Hollywood, basically tragic demigods that we've made them. One of the problems with vampire fiction, as opposed to zombie fiction, is because the vampire is so interesting and their experience is so tragic, they've become the story. So much so that it's become about them and less about the humans in the story, which means we don't have characters that are our proxies. We're not directly relating to the central characters of the story anymore. In zombie fiction, there are some, a few zombie stories where the zombie has enough personality to drive story, but the biggest, for example, the biggest part of the, and also the Doctor becomes a zombie in Monster Island, Monster Nation, Monster Planet. But a lot of the zombie stories, the zombie is a mindless thing. It is the allegory, the thing that we fear, and that's different for everybody who writes it, and often different for everyone who reads it. I mean, the author may intend a metaphor, but the reader may infer something different while reading it. So the story isn't about the monster, it becomes about the experience of people in a shared massive threat. They are now all facing the same type of fear, same type of threat, so we can then look at the individual characters. And often in these stories, even those that have great character development, the people become archetypes. Look at The Walking Dead, you can see those character profiles within the cast there. And we get to explore the human dynamic of people under stress, which is the basis of drama. People under stress, that's a completely flexible and inexhaustible storytelling model. It's not going to run out of steam. As long as writers are able to bring fresh insight into the experience of people undergoing terrible stress, and we haven't run out of steam since, with storytelling of that type since Gilgamesh, and it doesn't look like it's going to slow down. The genre's not going anywhere.
Dana, you must have an opinion on the zombie popularity at the moment.
Okay, well, they actually said a lot of what I had written down. I write notes because I have a terrible memory, so I scrawl notes to myself. It's like, yeah, this is the thing I'm going to say. Crap, you just said it. Crap, you just said it. You have to have good characters, and what people are interested in when they're writing a story or when they're reading a story is how the characters deal with it. What happens to the characters? You can have the greatest plot in the world, but if there's flat, two-dimensional characters that don't really grow or anything, it's going to be a boring book. And so, yes, the zombie thing is, whether it's intended or not, usually a metaphor for something, an implacable force, whether it's a natural disaster or economic woes or terrorism or something like that, and it's about how people deal with that situation. I was a police officer during Katrina, and so after Katrina, in the New Orleans area, okay? After Katrina, it was an apocalyptic event. I mean, I have lived through an apocalyptic event, and we lived in a post-apocalyptic world. We had no clean water, no electricity, there was no infrastructure. I mean, everything was destroyed, libraries, schools, everything. And so, and we didn't think it would be better, even though we knew in the back of our head that there was another part of the country out there that would eventually come help us. Even though, logically you can know that the help will be on the way, it was a long time before help came. And so the mentality of how people reacted to that situation was amazing. There were some people who really banded together in their neighborhoods and put up the spray-painted signs that said, "We will shoot looters." And then there were, of course, the looters. And then the stories of people who hated each other, who came together and helped each other out. Didn't matter whether they hated each other, they were going to come together for this thing. And that was a really fascinating thing that I got out of that disaster. And of course, eventually it did get better. Different, but better. And so I'm fascinated by stories where it's like, several years after the apocalypse, how people are dealing with that sort of thing. And I'm not sure if I answered that question.
Into the new normal. Before we sort of open up to questions from the audience, which I hope there will be, I hope you've got some, and I hope there'll be good ones, and I hope some of you don't have some, and you know who you are. But I'd like to ask a question, very basic one, it seems to be fundamental to everyone along the road. What scares you? Adam, why don't you?
In listening to everybody's extremely thoughtful answers about zombies, I was wondering if I was going to be forced to answer that question, and if so, what the fuck I was going to say. And I think the thing that I would add to what's been said, and also what scares me, is I think with zombies, unlike these other monsters, unlike vampires or werewolves, all of those suggest the possibility of another form of sort of sentient existence, right? A vampire, a werewolf. These are other ways to be in the world and still maintain your brain, your soul. And so they are scary, but they suggest the possibility of, a higher power or a universe where we don't turn to dust and die, never to be heard from again. And I think zombies are the opposite. Zombies suggest that we are alone in the universe, and that the only thing that can happen to us is various kinds of degradation, and that if we continue to live beyond being human, it'll be in the most horrifying possible way. And I think what scares me, and I think what scares us all, and what we've grappled with as people for as long as we've been on this planet, is the notion of what happens to us when we die, and the terrifying fear that the answer is nothing. We disappear, our essence vanishes, doesn't go anywhere. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no afterlife. It's just us, it's just here, it's just now. One of the animating tensions that I'm sort of dealing with in my book is that of new religion versus old. Like back in the day, man died for God. And at some point, with the advent of the current age and Judeo-Christian values, that flipped and it became God dies for man. God makes a sacrifice for man, Jesus Christ on the cross, etc. And what I play with in the book is the notion that that's actually a perversion and there's no truth to it, and the original formulation is correct. God lives, man dies for God. Man is sacrificed for God, man is insignificant. And I think ultimately, the biggest fear that any of us have is that, there's no meaning beyond the here and now, and we're spending our time here fruitlessly, frittering it away, bullshitting, and then that's it, and it's a wrap. Hey!
I'm the first.
Golf swing, yeah.
It now occurs to me that I thought that at the end of this line of questioning I was going to be terrified out of my wits. Now I'm going to be suicidal. Richard, what scares you?
To keep sort of in the zombie world, it isn't zombies themselves, but one of the zombies represent, which is the mob, the sort of mindless group. And, think of any riot, think of happy sports fan after somebody wins a Super Bowl. You see the larger the group of people, no offense here, the larger the group of people, the lower the IQ as a group.
That's really only true at literary
Yes, this is the exception. But I find that one of those interesting things that's sort of been throughout human history, that you can't get people who are too angry or too excited in one place at one time without explosive consequences. And that's always frightened me, just sort of mindlessness of what humans can be.
What frightens me is things I can't control, especially when it comes to protecting my daughter. I have a 9.5-year-old daughter, and the stuff that scares me is that something might happen to her, someone might do something bad to her, or that I might get sick or something happen to me and I won't be around to protect her. And I know this is not just a maternal thing, it's men and women both. Anyone who has kids probably understands this, that I'm actually in the same mind. I identify with agnostic atheist, so I think that this is the life we have, and at the end of it, that's it. But it's not just you're gone. You live on through the works you do, through the people who remember you, and through your children. So, yeah, I am terrified that someday something will happen to my child and I won't be able to do a thing about it.
Spiders. Thank you. Drowning is a bad one for me. Yeah, that's about it. No, I'm afraid of just about everything. If I wasn't heavily medicated right now, I'd be throwing the ball, rocking back and forth on the floor. Because I'm terrified of public speaking and crowds and convention centers. Really any large building. New York City, which is a shame because I live here. Breathing, although I'm working on that one. No, I'm being facetious, but if you're going to be a horror writer, you have to be able to be afraid and you have to be able to be scared. You get jaded very easily because you sit there and you watch 25 horror movies in a row from research, and they stop being scary. I find that I need occasionally to give myself a quick jolt. Every October, I go to a haunted house, and it's fascinating because the haunted houses you go to tend to be really cheesy and dumb, and it's always the same thing. It always ends with a guy with a fake chainsaw who comes out and chases you. There's always a room full of sexy vampire women. It's so dumb. And you walk in there and you're like, oh, yeah, great, they've got like the same 3 zombie pictures on the wall. And then, you know, somebody like hits 2 pieces of metal together behind your head. You scream because it is terrifying. It will always be terrifying. Actually being in a place full of scary things will always be terrifying. And that really kind of wakes me up and gets me able to write horror again. As a horror writer, I really do recommend, you know, scaring the fuck out of yourself every once in a while. It really helps.
For me, the thing that I'm most afraid of is losing control of my mind. I did a book called Dead of Night in which I explored that a bit. While I was writing that, my father-in-law, who was a brilliant musician, was going through dementia. And his brilliant mind was fragmenting. He was losing control of his body and his mind bit by bit, day by day, and that was a terrifying thing for me. Now, I'm physically not afraid of much. 49 years in martial arts and I'm a former bodybuilder. I'm not afraid of a lot physically, but of losing control of my ability to think and express myself, that's terrifying. What I did in the book to explore it is, the zombies in that particular book, the personality of each person who'd become a zombie is trapped inside the body. They can feel, taste, and experience what the body does, but they have zero control over it. They're just passengers and witnesses to the murders. And that was, you know, the way in which I explored the loss of control and the horror inflicted upon those you love by a disease under which you have no control. It was truly frightening for me.
I think it is a tricky one to answer because it changes often what scares you and what doesn't. I think for me it's a degree of control juxtaposed to vulnerability. You know, it's like if you go camping in the woods by yourself, on certain occasions, depending on how you feel, you may feel just fine. There may be no level of fear or anxiety. But it doesn't take a lot for your mind to kind of break that down. You start to feel like you're more and more vulnerable as time goes on, or as the evening progresses. Just a couple of crickets may actually start to get your nerves going in the wrong direction. That same feeling of lack of control over your surroundings can happen in your own room, it can happen in a car, it can happen just idly thinking about circumstances that may happen to you or your life, and also your loved ones. I think for me, it's that slip of control, that risk of knowing that you could be vulnerable at some point and you can't get it back.
Man, I'm scared of everything. I'm scared I'm gonna mess up my next book. I'm scared that something's gonna happen to my daughter. I'm scared that that person who came to one of my signings and waited in line to see me is gonna walk away thinking, man, that wasn't worth it. Like, I think that I do a good job of writing characters and exploring their own fears, and I think it's because I'm scared of everything. Like, I have a tendency to overthink everything and find out how, like, me dropping that coin is going to end up in the sky falling and everybody dying, and it's all being my fault. It's looking at me, that's your fault. And so I think that it certainly helps inform my fiction. It helps me explore people because people are defined by their fears. And so by being scared of everything, I think that I am able to get a good insight into other people because of that. But what's important is to just, even if you're scared of something, you run right at it. My friend Mike Cole taught me that. Just when you're scared of something, just run right at it. And I try and live my life like that. I don't let anything I'm scared of stop me, but I live in a perpetual state of fear.
The entire sport of bullfighting rose from the same sentiment, I'm sure. We have some time for some questions from, David, yes?
I don't have a question,
Okay.
but, sir, you were right there in the back. Could you put your hood back up? Okay, this guy scares me. And he's really good at me. He should get extra panel points for that. You can take it down now. I know it's hard to
You have a moment for a rebuttal if you'd like. Any questions from the crowd? You, yes.
I know that some of you have written for both adults and young adults, and the claim to fame for many of these monsters is being very bloody and happy. Do you have this hold back at all for your young adult versions?
I sure as hell didn't for Rotten Ruin. I start off by killing 7 billion people. There's a lot of violence in there. The trick is just to make sure that the violence is story appropriate, not gratuitous. But that should also be the same in adult fiction. You're not writing to exploit, and you're not writing to make a fool of the reader. You're writing a story that has violence in it because that's the pathway to telling the story. That doesn't change for adults or teens.
You, sir.
So one thing that a lot of these monsters for is very unambiguous endings. Like, think of all some of the latest Call of Duty games throwing Nazi zombies. And that's pretty much the most morally unambiguous ending you could possibly find. So how do you guys, in dealing with monsters, address moral ambiguity? Maybe not the monster, but through some how they're created or something, or some other character?
I think that you're right that it's very easy to throw monsters into something and have them just be evil and get their heads blown off and everybody gets the little cathartic thrill. If you're writing monsters well, though, they are ambiguous. All the good monsters are at least a little bit ambiguous in one way or another. Vampires are pretty evil, but say werewolves, they're human most of the time and they're really tormented by what they're going through. Frankenstein's monster was incredibly lonely. Even zombies, they're ambiguous because they're not scary in the normal way. They're not like, they're not that tough. They're not like giant beasts with like 8-inch fangs and covered in fur. They look like people, and that makes them very unsettling. So any good monster, the ambiguity is right there. You just have to tap into it.
Yeah, I think you've got to have complexity in all of your characters, including your villains, your bad guys. To me, real Nazis are way scarier than Nazi zombies. Right? Am I the only one who feels like actual Nazis are more scary?
That really shouldn't be a controversial statement.
Yeah.
They're like zombies, but they have animal content. One of the dumbest things
Yes, you. You, sir.
Do you feel like in some of the zombie stuff that I see, I feel like the movie Zombieland is a good example. That people are they're looking forward to this world almost.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and it's a weird thing in a lot of apocalyptic fiction. A lot of people seem to think that the apocalypse is going to be a reset that will cancel out their debt, make them more interesting, do all these things, and then they'll survive it. And no, most people are not going to survive it. It's not going to increase quality of life, and it's not going to solve their problems. But people seem to think that, like all the people who were invested in the Mayan apocalypse, they were looking forward to it. It's like, are you nuts? They really do seem to think that not only will it solve problems, but they are the person who's going to rise above, survive, maybe be the charismatic leader that leads us all into paradise. I'm here to tell you that is most people, including me. That's no.
How do you tell that when, sort of by definition, you're writing the book about the survivors?
By showing characters not accomplishing that and not getting those rewards.
Let me coach, I can totally do it.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Actually coming off kind of what he's saying, I find it kind of interesting that if you read some of these old Dracula, Frankenstein, those werewolf stories, you kind of see a coming together of people and a fight against evil, but with zombies you see the opposite. You see the world end, but people are still people. They're good, they're bad, they're evil, they're not evil, they're moral. Do you think that that's sort of an outgrowth of the genre itself, or is it like representative of the age in which they gain popularity?
I think it's a greater awareness of how the world works because of internet and communication. Like in the Vietnam War, that was pretty much the first time people saw a war, saw the actual reality of it. And now we see it every day. We see the brutal reality of stuff that happens all over the world. And so I think we have this more realistic outlook of, it's not going to be bright, sunshiny, everyone come together. There are a lot of dicks out there who are out for themselves. Go back to Katrina again. I mean, lots of people profited really horribly off that, including people in government and even the crack dealer in the street. So yeah, I think it's just a greater awareness of how people are.
So I completely agree with Diana. I mean, like after September 11th, we had one day when the whole world is like, we're all Americans today, and then we fucked it all up. And I think that we want to believe, that it's going to be like Pacific Rim, and if there's this huge, amazing threat, the whole world is going to come together and end all of our problems and end governments and all join together for something. But the reality is that human nature is always going to preside. Like maybe in the moment of absolute terror, you're willing to follow along, but the moment you're not absolutely terrified every second of every day, everybody's going to split apart and be out for themselves, and that's not going to change. And so it is a more realistic look at what the world is like. And I mean, it's less hopeful, but I think that comes from us seeing a broader sampling of the world in modern culture.
In the back, to you, sir.
When it comes to writing, I feel that there are like two forms of evil in terms of monsters. There's the general evil, which is the monster you may see in mass groups of horror and creation and just pure evil. But then there's the greater one, a literal individual evil that's literally seems to be crafted by hellish nightmares and all that, personified. Which is more interesting to write for you guys?
It's a very well done question. It's like a headlight.
There's no such thing as really pure evil. I mean, evil is complicated. If you have an evil character in a book who's evil just because he's evil, that's freaking boring. I'm sorry, fucking boring. And look at, I'm going to say politics for a second. People in politics who we might think are just absolutely evil, they have intentions that to them are noble. And most people do. Sometimes, yeah, lots of profit to them is very noble. But there are very few people who are just absolutely evil for the sake of evil. They have a goal, but they have a desire to reach that goal in a way that is completely monstrous to us. So again, like other people said, it has to be a full character. And if you explore why they do this evil thing, it's a lot more interesting. Because then you can almost identify with them. Not agree, but identify.
We got time for one more, Scott. One more genius, awesomest question. I think it might be you.
Let's do this.
No pressure.
I was going to ask, when you guys all write your own zombie novels, I've always, when I read those kind of things, I see that the zombies always seem to follow the same thing in the way that when someone becomes a zombie, they cease to be a mystery. You know they're going to try killing you, you know they're no longer in control of themselves. And by comparison, the human characters tend to, you don't know what they're going to do, because as we said, human beings can be anything from noble to complete jackasses who are only in it for themselves. So when you're writing, do you ever try taking that aspect of your character, kind of showing that zombies are simple, but just that humans, they can actually be worse in the way they deal with each other?
I tried writing complicated zombies as you did. In the zombie mythology I created, there are actually different sort of levels of zombies, some of which are the mindless horde, some of which are, aside from the fact they eat people, are pretty indistinguishable from human beings. You don't have to stick to any model. I mean, it depends on the function of the zombie in your, the metaphorical function of the zombie in your book. But there's really no reason to follow the old model.
I mean more like the dynamic between how zombies, humans can actually be worse to each other than zombies and zombies.
Well, part of it is it's a matter, if you're talking about the mindless zombies, I mean, they in the stories where they're mindless, where they have no personality, they represent something like a plague or some force that isn't malevolent, that has no conscience. Right. The humans are the ones with intent. So evil is a quality of intent. It's not a quality of action. So a virus is an evil. A person could be evil. So the moral complexities are often explored in the human characters because that's where complexity lies. Now, in stories where you have thinking zombies, then you get to play with that moral complexity, but viewed through the lens of what they are, what they believe they are, what they want, what their worldview is.
So I think we've gotten the high sign that we've got to wrap up. But all of our panel will be at autograph table 21 just moments from now. So go visit, continue the conversation, buy a book. Thank you to all of our